Yes, hello, and a very good afternoon to our viewers and participants, and welcome to the online discussion, The Future of the Multilateral Rule-Based International Order. This event is jointly organized by the Federal Trust, the Global Policy Institute, and the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. My name is Matthias Barner, and I'm representing the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation in the United Kingdom and Ireland. Today, we would like to speak and discuss with you about the current and the future trends of multilateral cooperation. Only a little more than a week ago, the G7 leaders met here in the United Kingdom for the first time in almost 2 years. It was an eagerly awaited event and perceived as a chance to deliver a vital sign of multilateralism. But to be honest, all this happened and happens in a very challenging geopolitical environment. A challenging geopolitical environment due to power shifts in the international system on the one hand, and on the other hand, due to the rise of illiberal forces that are hostile towards multilateralism. So there's plenty to discuss, and I'm very pleased to welcome our three distinguished speakers today, starting with Velina Tchakarova. She's the director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy based in Vienna. Good afternoon or good evening. Then Dr. Zachary Paikin. He's a researcher at the Center for European Policy Studies, a non-resident research fellow with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy in Toronto in Canada, and a senior visiting fellow at the Global Policy Institute. And last but not least, welcome to my colleague, Dr. Olaf Wientzek from the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation in Geneva. He is the director of our Multilateral Dialogue Program, Geneva. And a warm welcome to Brendan Donnelly, the director of the Federal Trust, who will chair again today's discussion. So I'm now looking forward to the views of the panel speakers and then to the Q&A session with the audience later. Thank you very much for joining us. I will now hand over to Brendan, and let me express again our gratitude as Konrad-Adenauer Foundation to cooperate with the Federal Trust on this regular basis for many, many years. Brendan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Always a great pleasure to work with the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, and a number of directors of the foundation have been very good friends of the Federal Trust, and you're certainly a very worthy representative of that line. Thank you very much for all your support. I think the title that we have this evening is a fairly self-explanatory one. And we've asked the three speakers to concentrate on particular areas of this question, specifically geographic regions where they have some particular personal knowledge or expertise. But before I ask the speakers to give us their presentations, can I put a framework to the whole discussion, which is to say that it seems to me that there's very crudely and very stereotypically, two views about the future of the world, the rule-based multilateral order. There's one view that says that Mr. Trump was an unfortunate intermission, and that now that Mr. Biden has taken over, it will be possible for the EU and the European Union and the United States to work together to create a pole of attraction for democratic, rule-based governance in the world, and that the particularly refractory major powers, Russia and China, for economic and political reasons, will gradually be drawn to this pole of attraction. The other view is to say that Russia and China, for differing reasons, are simply not interested in the rule-based multilateral world order, and that it's a delusion to think that they are. Sometimes this issue goes with the idea that the EU is deceiving itself about the eagerness and capacity of Mr. Biden to work in re-establishing the multilateral world order. That the ratchet effect of Donald Trump has been such that there's no way back to the halcyon days of the turn of the century. I'd be interested if all the speakers could put themselves somewhere on that spectrum of crude analysis, or to say that the spectrum of analysis is entirely wrong. But I would, in addition to their specific expertise and specialisms, welcome some general thoughts from all our very, very stimulating and distinguished speakers. Dr. Wientzek, you were rightly introduced by Matthias as being a specialist in multinational organizations. WHO and WTO, I think, are particular interests of yours. And I think that you're going to be talking a bit, among other things, about the role of China in these multinational organizations. So once again, Dr. Wientzek, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, and I'm always honored to be asked by the Federal Trust. I've had the pleasure to get to know your organization during the times of Hans Blomeyer, so the predecessor and the pre-predecessor, if I'm not mistaken. And it was I've always much appreciated your analysis on various issues. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm indeed going to talk from a Geneva perspective. Now, I would like to raise 5 points, basically. So first of all, these are very interesting times for the multilateral system, because actually you can see now the potential relevance, at least, of these multilateral organizations. I mean, the WHO, for example, has had a very important role to play, giving advice, coordinating research, coordinating the distribution of diagnostics, of vaccines, and so on, via the COVAX initiative, delivering materials, launching important initiatives. And I think it's better than its, let's say, reputation. I would say the same thing for the WTO. Actually, the pandemic is, to a certain extent, an opportunity for the WTO to demonstrate its possibility to actually do something which is also to be felt by the usual citizens. So, for example, its fight against export restriction of goods important in the context to either produce vaccines or to let's say, for diagnostics or therapeutics to fight against COVID. The WTO has potentially a very important role. The same goes for various humanitarian organizations, for various global health organizations, also such as the Vaccine Alliance, Gavi. So in many ways, while some of these organizations have been strongly criticized, given their mandate, I would even argue that at least for the WHO, it does not have, I mean, it did not do such a bad job. I know that it has received quite a bad press, but actually things, given its competencies, the WHO has not been doing that badly. However, this leads me to my second point. The crisis also has demonstrated the limits of these organizations, and these multilateral organizations are always based on the, let's say, the room of maneuver is always based on the will of their member states to allow them to do their job. Now, given the particularly tense geopolitical climate, of course, this reflects also on the capacity to act of these various multilateral organizations. So one sees the potential added value of these organizations, but one also sees the limits. One problem which we saw repeatedly during the crisis, during the pandemic, but also before, is that these organizations tend to have a behavior of pussyfooting around the member states or before the member states, not calling them out. I mean, there has been a lot of criticism oriented towards WHO, that it's basically strongly influenced by China, and that China has, I don't know, that it's particularly, it has a pro-China bias. I wouldn't go that far. I would just say that the WHO organizations like WHO would just never criticize member states in public. And when they need access, when they're completely depending on member states to have access to epidemic sites, to certain data, they will rather be friendly and praise them, even though this praise for China, which has been sometimes expressed by WHO representatives, seems very odd given what actually happened. This is something which you see towards other member states as well. I mean, there was a report in May 2020, for example, initially published by the WHO, which was quite critical of Italy's crisis management, which was then taken back, which was taken off the website, which was retracted, and without even, let's say, strong pressure by the Italian government, but rather out of, let's say, out of fear that this might actually be counterproductive in the relation to the member states. Let's look at the US. The WHO has never once officially criticized the, let's say, the pandemic management, or the epidemic, the crisis management by the Trump administration. So let's say this is not only a problem towards China, but pussyfooting around member states is a general problem which you often see in these organizations. You see also that, of course, reform is needed in these organizations. The pandemic has shown that very clearly, that many of these organizations lack instruments. They have often very capable secretariats, but secretariats which cannot, I mean, which have little competences. You have the problem of underfunding. The WHO, for example, has to get 80% of, I mean, it has basically assessed contributions of only 20%, so 80% are voluntary contributions. I mean, good luck managing a pandemic with that. And in the end, the lack of authority or sanctioning mechanism is a key problem which we see in many of these organizations. Given all that, of course, another problem which we have seen, because these first problems, I would say they're not particularly new. I mean, this has, I think, been the case for a long time. Underfunding of multilateral organizations has been a problem for a while. The problem that they're, of course, strongly dependent on the member states, well, that's nothing new either. But what we also see, and that brings me to my third point, is we see increasingly assertive authoritarian actors in these organizations. Most of all China, but not only China. China, to get to your questions, we see that China is trying to engage particularly strongly in some, not all, multilateral organizations here in Geneva, but particularly those which are setting economic or digital standards. So standards development organizations which nobody knows about, but which sit here in Geneva and which are very important to set or to agree on global digital standards, for example. So there, China is very present, either with government representatives or with business representatives, such as the ITU, so the International Telecommunication Union, UNICE, but also, let's say, economic organizations, like so the WTO. And China is also very much paying attention to organizations which can possibly be an inconvenience to them, such as the UN Human Rights Council, where it hopes to water down criticism oriented towards its practices. And this is not only true, of course, for China, but also for other authoritarian states. What is really new, because of course that's not particularly news, but what we see in these past years in Geneva is that China also tries to shape the discourse in multilateral institutions, to trying what I would like to call promoting alternative multilateralism. Multilateralism is not equal multilateralism. Even rule-based multilateralism is not equal rule-based multilateralism, because of course for us multilateralism also has something to do with certain values, with a, let's say, people-centric view and not a collectivist or, let's say, a group-centric view of certain values. And of course China tries increasingly to challenge this exact discourse. Sometimes China does that with via resolutions which have a very harmless name. So one resolution which China brings regularly before the Human Rights Council, which, by the way, is regularly also accepted with the votes of many countries, even of some democracies, is called mutually beneficial cooperation, which basically argues for a dog don't eat dog approach to human rights, meaning that states basically cover each other and don't criticize each other too harshly. And also trying to move from individual rights more to collective rights, arguing for the human right, let's say, of development, and thus blurring actually what initially our idea of human rights was. So this is something to be observed also in the coming years. We also see that China is trying to build, or Russia, one could say the same thing, in the UN Human Rights Council, a certain what I would call an autocratic international, which is ready to shield China from public criticism in multilateral fora. So I can guarantee you that you will never get a resolution on China's policy towards Xinjiang or towards Hong Kong for the UN Human Rights Council. You will not get a majority. So you don't even try it. What you can do, of course, is to make a joint statement, which other countries also subscribe to. But to have a full-blown resolution, you will not get the majority. Because also China, of course, shields other countries. China is shielding, for example, Russia does the same thing, by the way, Venezuela, Cuba, Syria. So I would say the worst of the worst, but not only those, also other countries such as Cameroon, which remember that China blocked, for example, a resolution which was hostile to it, and which will be very grateful and continue to vote in the favor of China. In many ways, you see sometimes in this organization also kind of heat map of economic influence of China when you look at the voting patterns in different fora. Of course, for China, it's also, and other authoritarian actors, these fora are also a possibility to acquire legitimacy. So, of course, Xi Jinping, when he was speaking at the at the World Health Assembly in 2020, he described China and China's policy as the one of a friend of multilateralism, of a global benefactor, promising to treat a vaccine as a global good, and so on. What we see, however, also is that embracing, they talk the talk, but they don't necessarily walk the walk. So we also have seen hesitancy from China to really link up to multilateral initiatives such as COVAX, where actually you cannot only reward your best friends, but you basically have to distribute global goods to everyone, irrespective of their stance towards you. We also see that there are some organizations where China does not play a role at all. For example, the UNHCR, or the International Organization of Migration. I mean, if you look at the UNHCR budget, so the UN Refugee Agency, the US is giving basically 1,000 times as much money to the UNHCR than China. So this is of course a stark contrast to other organizations. So let's say on some issues, China's engagement is also very selective. Now, despite all those doom and gloom, I would say that the West is not lost. To come back to your initial remark is, I mean, the Biden administration does make a difference in many points. The US is back. Its very difference is to be seen in the WTO and the WHO, in the UN Human Rights Council, which does not mean, of course, that the US is suddenly a fluffy and partner without any interest. Of course not. Of course, on some issues, the partnership between, let's say, the EU, but also the UK and the US remains rather difficult, but it has changed a lot the dynamic, and now there is a bit more pushback against also, let's say, China's and other authoritarian actors' assertiveness in these organizations. We have a couple of encouraging examples when we look at personnel for policy. So, for example, there was a broad alliance crafted also by the US in the World Intellectual Property Organization, where they could actually manage to avoid a Chinese national to be the new Secretary General of that organization. We see also that there is more, let's say, more resistance at, for example, the ITU. The West is still a major donor, of course, in almost all these organizations, be it humanitarian, be it global health organizations or migration organizations. And the West has still played a very important role, for example, in the COVAX initiative. Now, I would like to finish with what to do, or what one could do addressing this point. So, first of all, what is very important is continuous engagement. So take these multilateral bodies seriously. They may, in many cases, such as the UN Human Rights Council, make decisions which you don't agree with, which are deplorable, because, of course, these organizations are composed of all member states, and many member states are, of course, autocracies, others are mixed regimes. But retreating from these organizations, and that's these past years during the Trump administration have shown, will not delegitimize these organizations in the eyes of most of the member states, but rather it will strengthen authoritarian actors. Strategic personnel policy is a very important point. Don't compete inside the global West. Don't compete against each other, because I can guarantee you that the one which will come out of top is a candidate which you will like even less. It's important to coordinate not amongst only the EU, but also with, let's say, classic allies, with the UK, with even with countries like Japan, Australia, New Zealand, let's say the like-minded. But it's even more important to go beyond these alliances, because with just the global West and the like-minded, you don't have a majority. You need at some point to also get the African group or the Latin American group, or most countries from the Latin American group on board to have majorities. So it will be important for, let's say, the global West, for the like-minded, for the UK, for the EU, to join forces also with countries where on some issues we might disagree, but which are not in the fully authoritarian camp yet, which are important to get on your side to get a majority. It's also very important to call out alternative multilateralism. That's key. Even if you don't get to pass certain resolutions, you make at least a joint statement. Call them out on, let's say, their attempts to change the discourse on multilateralism. That's of crucial importance. And in this case, I must say that the UK, in a few cases, has played a very important role. And in the end, you will need tough love for multilateral organizations. You need to support them. You should not disengage, but you should push for reforms, such as now on the WHO. I think we do have a window of opportunity to change a couple of things, and you should not gloss over problematic developments, even in the WTO, where sometimes the EU has a tendency to do that. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I hope these were some ideas which may help for the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much indeed, Olaf. Absolutely fascinating and very, very informative. Can you tell us a bit more about how you see this coincidence of interest with African states and Latin American states working? What would be the areas of cooperation and overlap?
I would say that, for example, with Latin American countries, I mean, depends which ones, of course. You can't forget basically Venezuela and Cuba, and or let's say some of the, I would say the far left regimes. They are not allies, of course, but I would say they are potential allies, particularly Latin American countries, on many human rights issues, where you see that still they tend to vote in favor rather of, let's say, I would say the democratic line or the Western line in many ways. What is important, however, is that we should also recognize the priorities of these countries or these groups. So you cannot just say, well, but you should vote with us, it's the right thing to do, but you have to offer something as well, be it personnel policy-wise. And I think therefore it was a very good decision from the EU side to not put forward a candidate for the WTO Director General, for the WTO leadership. That was very important, because this one would have probably been shot down, as the UK candidate has had no chance basically in winning this thing. But very quickly putting, let's say, supporting the at least one of the African, I think in the end, two of the potential African candidates. It will also require a certain compromise on, I would say, on issues which do hurt. I would say, for example, the discussions on agriculture. Not popular, but something very important in WTO, and where I think the West will need to show a bit more flexibility. I would be less inclined to do so on the TRIPS waiver personally, but the pressure, of course, is very big on that one. I would say in global health also to make it less a discussion which is only made by the West, but also to, when we talk about reforming the WHO, when we talk about the pandemic treaty, to include more African countries in the discussion, because otherwise it's just Germany, France, Canada, the US maybe, and from the African side, maybe only South Africa leading the discourse, but it should be a broader debate. So also to try to increase ownership on that. one should never underestimate the African group here in Geneva. They tend to be very rather well organized, especially when it comes to personnel questions, and you will not always have them as a let's say as an ally, but I think more could be done both on trade issues as well as Human Rights Council issues. And to actually, I forgot to reply to your initial questions between, let's say, the two poles. I think that basically with Biden you will have a rosy time for multilateralism and the doom gloom scenario. If we say the doom gloom scenario is 0 and the let's say the rosy scenario is 10, I would say the current outlook is at 4.
Okay, well, that's a very clear answer to my question. Thank you very much. Now we're going to go to Velina, and we're particularly delighted to have her here. Thank you very much for joining us, coming from Austria. And obviously, you're going to talk particularly about the European Union, on which you've written extensively, but any more general comments you want to make about where on the spectrum you stand would be of great interest to us. Velina.
Well, thank you very much once again for having me. And I have to underline that I have been closely observing global power competition for the last 10 years. And of course, the field of multilateral norms and rules was of a special interest, the way how global actors such as the United States was shaping the narrative and was participating or not participating in multilateral structures was very interesting to observe. But then again, of course, the trends which actually became quite obvious in the last 7-8 years linked to not just China, and my colleague already outlined the main points about it, but also coordination between China and third actors, which, for instance, I call the dragon bear when it came to systemic coordination with Russia. And I would like to actually, before we move to the European Union perspective, which right now is an actor that is pretty much put in the corner when it comes to multilateralism, the one actor that is waving the flag of effective multilateralism and wants to be this kind of global actor, but no one wants to listen to us, more or less. I will explain later about it. So first and foremost, I was thinking about outlining some of the key trends regarding global norms and rules derived from my work. And I just did the research on the United Nations Security Council, where I looked carefully at how China and Russia basically coordinated positions. And maybe this will be interesting for the audience to present very shortly the outcome of this research before I move to the trends, namely that for the last several years, so basically for a period of 9 to 10 years, there has been a total of 657 resolutions that were adopted within the UN Security Council. And of course, still the majority of them, over 90%, were adopted anonymously. However, and this is now the interesting part, until 2019, 22 vetoes were cast, with the highest number of vetoes taking place in 2017 and then 2019. And last year marked again 3 vetoes on UN Security Council draft resolutions, by whom you would guess, by the dragon bear. So 2 were on Syria and 1 on Venezuela. Whereas the counter-proposed resolutions, draft resolutions by China and Russia were, of course, also vetoed by other permanent and elected members. So this trend is definitely showing us already that there is a systemic coordination. My colleague also mentioned Iran, Syria, Libya, Venezuela, definitely the case. And I anticipate that this trend will grow in the future. And there is, this is what my research showed, clearly a shift in the pattern of behavior by China and also Russia, as the majority of these vetoes was basically aimed at blocking resolutions. and they were all attributed to these two countries. Also, most abstention votes in the same period regarding Iran, Syria, and Libya stemmed also from these actors. So why did I tell you this story? Because I suppose that this kind of patterns of behavior will increase not only at the creme de la creme of global diplomacy, which is the UN Security Council, but of course, once being effective mechanism, it might spread to our other multilateral organizations. And let's not forget that Russia, of course, still carries the institutional legacy from the Soviet Union. Now we are closely observing this, for instance, with the revival of diplomatic channels and networks, for instance, in Africa or Latin America, where there were traditional hubs during the Cold War, where the Soviet Union had very strong ties, political, diplomatic, and military ones. So this is something that I think will pose a great challenge to the West, to the Europeans, and of course, to the United States. Another interesting point from this research I would like to immediately stress is that there is not so much the goal of actually making these institutions dysfunctional, but actually undermining them from within, disrupting them. Often it is about a mixture of various goals, either using certain multilateral structures to enhance the own image, of course, a positive one, but on the other side, of course, also to divide and rule, to place not just an own position, but also to basically, show that the position of the rival is a weak one. So this is very often also the case, and I think that we should be aware of this kind of trends. I also realized that there hasn't been any quantitative or qualitative research on that matter. So we need to really closely closely observe this kind of trends when it comes to the behavior of such disruptive actors within the multilateral institutions. To conclude on the case study, there is definitely a correlation between Chinese and Russian voting behavior between 2007 and 2019. Now, moving to some of this so-called trends regarding the global power competition, the way I see global multilateralism and its development is that my anticipation goes more in the direction that it is going to face even greater erosion, which is not only accelerated by the American withdrawal from international obligations and organizations, and we can discuss this later about Biden's role, about the role of the Biden's administration, of course, and the role of the European Union. But I think we are still very much at the level of more or less verbal promises rather than actions, because first and foremost, it's all about the socioeconomic recovery from the pandemic. And then again, it is also about the growing polarization between the United States on the one hand and China and Russia on the other. So right now we have not one, but two major disruptive forces. This has been already identified by various strategic documents. So as you saw on the case of the United Nations Security Council, it would result in a deadlock on various significant global issues. I see the case also with the World Health Organization. Just let me give you the example that today China stated that it expects from the United States to actually give an access to their laboratories and to basically provide the audience and the population with enough information regarding all biolabs and so on and so forth. So we already observed this kind of further polarization. And not only the United Nations with its whole family, but also other international organizations have already been impacted by this ongoing global power competition. So this is nothing new. This hasn't started under Trump. Even during Obama, this was already the case, but Obama had a different institutional approach towards China. And we might argue that Biden would return to this kind of institutional approach. But then, of course, the question is whether this will be enough, this will be sufficient. So there is indeed a realization about diminished role of the UN Security Council, linked on the one hand to Washington's declining international role. There is also split, very often there is also split between Western allies and partners when it comes to their role within international organizations. And there was the case, for instance, I think in 2020, when China could actually win the chair within one of the UN organizations, just because the United States and Europe, I think it was France, were supporting different candidates. So this is also a case that we are not always on the same page. We are not always understanding also the same thing when it comes to multilateralism and the way we see actually our global role. I think that multilateralism is at risk of becoming kind of a buzzword, one of the next buzzwords, which reflects more or less an institutional reminiscence from the Cold War, as the Security Council has been often a playground for diplomatic battles between these two major groups of countries. This is going to increase. This is my expectation. And this dynamic could also resurface, reemerge, considering the growing polarization centered around the transatlantic community, because this is the next thing. Also, the transatlantic community is more or less not on the same page when it comes to its global role. Just to give you the example, with the last summit, where, for instance, there were internal debates as to how to deal with China. I think China was mentioned around 51 times in the communique, while, of course, Russia is still the threat number one. And obviously what I call the dragon bear. So basically you should understand not an alliance, but rather a kind of systemic coordination based on common shared interests. So this dragon bear operates within this existent global order quite well. And the goal is, like I said, to disrupt, to dysfunction where possible, where necessary, but also to create better conditions for their own concept of multilateralism, what I call in the Chinese case, a multilateralism with Chinese characteristics, and in the Russian case, I call it, they see it as a polycentric world, because the Russian position is that they do not want to have a unipolar world where one global power determines the global rules, norms, and standards. And yes, of course, there is no overt ideological competition yet, but the US-led liberal international order, because to me, this is still this international leverage from the last 75 years, which has, of course, been enhanced and been promoted by the United States together with allies and like-minded countries, specifically following the collapse of the Soviet Union 30 years ago. So this US-led liberal international order is facing now a threat from not just China, but also from the growing influence of the Chinese Communist Party, which pursues a very authoritarian ideology and a very, very authoritarian governance model. So we should be also aware of this trend, and I can give you one example. So following China's so-called global and regional rise, authoritarian regimes and ideas have in fact established a stronghold worldwide. So we are observing a trend of diminishing democracies in the world empirically. And at the very same time, if you look, for instance, at Southeast Asia, there are a lot of examples from a strong man in power in countries such as Myanmar or Thailand or Cambodia, or a single party system in some of these countries, or eroding democratic orders in others. This is definitely the case, but this is not an issue for a country like China, as we know. And of course, what was also outlined by my colleague with COVID-19 pandemic and the special role of China when it came to international vaccines. Let me remind you that China also sought to establish something that Beijing called Health Silk Road. So the Silk Road now has also a health component, and this is something that we should also keep in mind. So finally, I have a pessimistic scenario, and I have a little bit more optimistic one. So my
quite quickly
pessimistic scenario would be that a more radical, a consistent mutual institutional decoupling will continue between United States and allies and China, while an optimistic scenario would actually reveal a more peaceful systemic coexistence. And this coexistence will mean that Beijing will focus more on this alternative multilateralism. So this kind of alternative structures that Beijing has been building since 2013, 2014 will be at some point active, and Beijing will actually isolate the West from them. So we will engage with third parties without the participation of the West, but at least there will be no direct confrontation.
Thank you very much. A very, very interesting analysis. One thing you promised to tell us, but I don't think you mentioned, was why the European Union is ignored by everybody, why it doesn't play its role as an actor. Can you say something briefly about that?
Yes, absolutely. And this is something that I'm telling Brussels all the time. Because of lack of any military power, you cannot be on the negotiation table of any issue if you actually cannot provide your own military force, and I mean, even if you do not intend to apply it.
Good.
That's
a very clear answer. Thank you very much, Zach. Now we're going to go to our third speaker, who I'm sure will have some views on the ideas that have just been expressed. Tell us what you agree with, tell us what you disagree with, or talk about something completely different as far as Russia and the United States are concerned. Thanks very much for joining us, Zach.
Thanks very much, Brendan. It's a real pleasure to be with you again, and I have very fond memories of attending many events organized by the Federal Trust, occasionally in partnership with CEPS during my years in London during my doctoral studies. So very grateful for the invitation to be with you today, and great to have an opportunity to wear my GPI hat today, as well as Senior Visiting Fellow with the Global Policy Institute. I suppose that yes, I have been asked to speak about the United States and Russia, but I think that it might be useful to begin with a couple of conceptual arguments that might lead me in some respects to agree, and in some respects perhaps to lead me to different conclusions from those set forward by my two co-panelists. The first point is that every order, every international order, every domestic order in some respect is based upon rules, right? And you find this, in theoretical writings, by the likes of Hedley Bull, who discussed this in his, very famous treatise, The Anarchical Society. You find it as well in European history, in which, Alexander I, for example, after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, proposed, an international order to govern Europe that relied to a certain extent on certain shared rules and values as well, particularly between the members of the Holy Alliance. So every order to a certain extent is based on rules. The question is, what rules, what kind of rules, and whose rules? And that's particularly important for some powers such as Russia, right? Which, some scholars call a constitutionalist power. They care more about who's writing the rules rather than what the rules themselves are. So because that's the fact, because there are multiple forms of rules-based order that we could envisage, that's why the term that is used today, the rules-based international order that the West likes to invoke, can become politicized. And it sounds like a neutral term, oh yes, it's all just the rules that we all agree on. But when the West appears to be using it these days as a sledgehammer, basically, in order to push back against what they see as unacceptable Russian and Chinese behavior, it inevitably becomes political, right? Norms are inherently political. So that's my first point. And I suppose that, a natural corollary to that point is that today's so-called rules-based international order is only one component of all of the norms and principles and practices that are established within today's world order or international society, or call it what you will, right? So today's post-World War II multilateral regime is just one component of many of the norms that have been established, some of which concern, for example, the legitimacy of great power management, of great powers having a special role, in the Yalta Order, if you want to call it that, in managing and upholding international order. My second conceptual point, and I owe this to Natalie Tocci of IAI in Rome, is that multilateralism and multipolarity are not fundamentally incompatible. There's no reason why they need to be fundamentally incompatible. So today's shift from a unipolar order towards a more multipolar order shouldn't, on its own, by itself, be necessarily cause for consternation in Western circles. The problem, the fundamental incompatibility, as it were, is not between multilateralism and multipolarity, but rather between the so-called liberal international order and multipolarity. Because the liberal international order is not the same thing as the rules-based international order. And Olaf was getting at this a little bit before. The liberal international order has additional components as well, notions of shared values, particularly liberal values, which are not universally shared on a global stage, on a global scale. It also includes, to a significant extent, if only for historical reasons, if not for greater reasons for a need to have some sort of hegemonic stability, a component of American or Western leadership as well. That is a component of the liberal international order, but not of the rules-based international order, right? So those are two different phenomena right there, and I think that's important to highlight there. And I think it helps to answer your question, Brendan, to a certain extent, right? Which is, with Joe Biden now in the White House, is there going to be renewed momentum for rules-based order? Well, it's possible to envisage some sort of rules-based cooperation or multilateralism with Russia and China, but of a different kind to the rules-based international order that was birthed in the context of unipolarity in the 1990s, with all of the values, attached to that implied. So that's very much possible, but it's not possible to re-envisage, if you will, a world order of global scale that is, belonging to that features as an important component American leadership. That is something that Russia and China will never accept, and it's something that they won't accept under any Russian or Chinese regime, right? In the very unlikely event that Alexei Navalny becomes the next president of Russia, his first act in the Kremlin in office is not going to be to return Crimea to Ukraine. I can guarantee you that. And in the very unlikely event that China becomes a Western-style liberal democratic nation state, it will inherently be perhaps even, more assertive in its foreign policy than it is right now. If a nationalist population has more control, over the democratic levers of that country rather than the technocratic government that you have right now, because the fundamental legitimacy of the current regime in China, although there are other sources of legitimacy, economic growth, etc., is nationalism more than anything else. That is the outcome of the Chinese Civil War and of the century of humiliation. So I'll put those 2 points forward as sort of to frame the discussion conceptually. Now to the United States and then to Russia. Starting with the United States, I guess that between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, there are some elements of commonality and some important differences. But you could still see on a wider scale a broader trend that U.S. foreign policy is going towards, regardless of who the occupant of the White House is. So obviously there are some interesting differences regarding, the America's back type vocabulary, talking about resuscitating alliances and multilateralism. In particular, the JCPOA, the Iran deal negotiations have been proceeding in Vienna, albeit with some difficulty. the commonalities, I think, are quite interesting here, right? So the plan to withdraw from Afghanistan, that's still in place. It's been delayed by a few months until September 11th, but that's still very much in place. Another commonality is the focus on China first and foremost. Perhaps it's even more of a focus under the Biden administration than it was under Trump. Seeing that under Trump, the national security strategy unveiled in 2017 posited Russia and China both as rival powers, whereas now the focus is very clearly on formalized statements vis-a-vis, the need for competition and even an adversarial type relationship with China, whereas there's a desire to reach some sort of accommodation with Russia, even if it implies the continuation of an adversarial dynamic. It's not a reset by any stretch of the imagination. So that's still very much there. The Indo-Pacific nomenclature that was developed under the Trump administration, not by the Trump administration, but that gained currency under the Trump administration, is very much still there, despite the change of parties in the White House. So that's quite an interesting trend, to observe right there. So, put all of that together, and you include the JCPOA in this as well now, and you can see a growing trend starting from the second term of the Obama administration through Trump and now into Biden, of this pivot towards Asia, towards great power competition, but also towards elements of restraint in the eastward vector, of U.S. foreign policy, right? As it relates to the withdrawal from Afghanistan to the JCPOA, and now to Biden's recent initiative vis-a-vis Russia, in an effort to confront China as friendly as possible. And so that basically leads me to conclude that the United States foreign policy is currently in an intermediate stage of sorts, right? The pursuit of primacy and preeminence is still very much there, right? The United States is not prepared at this point to withdraw from being the most important term-setting country or military power in any of the major theaters on the globe. Or at least I should say in the world continent, in Eurasia, that is to say, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. That's still there, but there has been a transition nonetheless away from the vision of the 1990s and 2000s of being able to construct this sort of universal liberal international order of global reach. So it's not isolationism, and those people who criticize, Trump and others who, think like him of isolationism, that's not accurate. I mean, we could talk about restraint, we can talk about a pivot, we could talk about many things, but U.S. foreign policy is in an intermediate stage, still a form of transition from where it started off in the 1990s at this point. And so that leads to a conclusion, I think, that there's an acknowledgement, a tacit acknowledgement, but nonetheless an acknowledgement from the United States that the U.S.-led international order is not and cannot be of global scope for now. But the big question, I think, is it possible to put the cat back in the bag at this point, right? Once you've seen from the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, this whole set of globalizing dynamics, economically speaking, politically speaking, normatively speaking, et cetera, to create, what was, or at least in an attempt to create a liberal international order of global reach, is it possible simply to revert back to what existed before then, in which there were sort of self-contained international orders of non-global scope, which was the case in the early decades of the Cold War, or is that no longer possible? Is the fact that the cat is already out of the bag now, does that imply that there's going to be fundamental contestation over the rules of any sort of global order at this point in time? And if that is the case, then that means that the U.S. posture of primacy, which has not yet been abandoned at this point, will inherently drive, order transition in the world. It'll inherently drive a form of instability right now, because there's that fundamental conceptual tension, I think, that very much exists right now. So back to what I was saying at the beginning. The question is therefore not about the future of the multilateral order, as if there's just one multilateral order, but rather we need to imagine what sort of mixture of different forms of liberalism or rules-based cooperation can we imagine in today's world, right? What form of economic liberalism, that is to say free trade, globalization, et cetera. What form of political liberalism, that is to say support for democracy, human rights, fundamental values, et cetera. And what form of international liberalism in the form of rules-based cooperation, multilateralism. What combination of that can we expect? It's entirely possible that globalization will continue and that various forms of rules-based cooperation will continue, but the human rights component of the international order will be eroded with time. And if that's the case, then I think we should be careful we should not perhaps go so far as to say that the actions of or values or visions of Russia and China pose a fundamental existential challenge to the international order, but rather that they will simply cause the order that we have come to know over the past several decades to evolve in certain ways. And change is, of course, the norm, in international affairs. As much as we like to think that there's this one international order that was established, in 1945 under U.S. leadership at Bretton Woods, and that's been the same ever since. The fact is, international order is changing all the time, and so we need to get used to that fact, right now. And so in this rules-based component, what element of liberalism can we come to expect in this future international order? Well, look, I mean, the liberalism and liberal internationalism has demonstrated a great amount of resilience and adaptability throughout its history so far. From a very thin, pre-liberal order, if you will, in the 19th century with the gold standard and British leadership to a certain extent, into what John Eikenberry calls liberal internationalism 1.0 in the League of Nations, which featured, very strong liberal internationalist principles and national self-determination and rules-based order, but without strong enforcement mechanisms, into the, more rigid liberal internationalism 2.0 with much more robust institutions and a more rigid international law post-1945. It's adapted before. The question is, can it adapt now? Because those orders of the past were not truly global international orders. They might have, to a certain extent, had global scope or global reach from a geographic perspective. But in the 19th century, we had a core and a periphery. We had an imperial core in Europe and a periphery, and that is not a truly global order. That is a hierarchical order. The same goes for during the Cold War. We didn't have one international order. We had two rival, separate international orders. Now what we're seeing working out is, in effect, what is the world's first truly global international order, which is working itself out after the failure to establish in the 1990s the first truly global liberal international order. And so that raises fundamental questions about what role liberalism is going to play in the forthcoming order. Final points here on where Russia fits into all of this. Russia is fundamentally reactive in its posture vis-a-vis the United States. And that's not only because the United States is, as the hegemon, if you will, and the more powerful actor, the term setter in the relationship. It's also because of Russia's inherent need for great power status as a part of its identity. And that goes back centuries. That has nothing to do with the current regime. So that's a trend that we're going to see continue. And despite the post-2014, or perhaps 2012, if you will, so post-Bolotnaya protest conservative consolidation, of Russian nationhood to a certain extent, away from Russia having any genuine sort of aspirations to, construct not, a resurrection of the Soviet Union, but nonetheless a deeper form of relations with most of its near abroad. Towards now, what we see is Russia being more and more basically just Russia, with other powers having, significant influence, within Russia's so-called near abroad. Russia is still in this form of transition. We've seen the yardsticks move on that somewhat over the 30 years of Russia's, post-communist existence, but the yardsticks are still moving forward in terms of its national identity being in flux at this point in time. It is a new country, and that makes it very difficult for Russia to adopt, in some respects at least, a consistent strategy. So that leaves Russia in many ways, it doesn't deny it of agency by any stretch of the imagination, but it does leave it often in a reactive posture vis-a-vis the United States. It may not necessarily share Joe Biden's interest in a stable and predictable relationship that Biden has been talking about for the past few months, simply because of the asymmetry of power right there. And, Biden may want that stable relationship with Russia to allow him to pivot to China, but Russia has every desire to want to be noticed. And as long as a grand bargain is not going to be coming between the US and Russia to change the adversarial nature of their relationship, and one will not be forthcoming because it is a fundamental normative contestation that is occurring between the two of them over the shape of regional order in Europe and who has the right to do what in given countries and what fundamental state sovereignty means, including Ukrainian sovereignty. Does that mean they have the right to choose every last dimension of their international direction, including military and geopolitical direction? That debate is not going away anytime soon. It might wane to a certain extent in importance or in salience in international debates, but I don't see that fundamentally disappearing. So because of this, we're going to see that continuation of contestation between the two sides, between the United States and Russia. So yes, we can have potentially some elements of more predictability in the relationship between the two sides, some possible rules of the road. But because of that fundamental normative rivalry, we are looking at a prolonged confrontation. So what that means is that it's basically up to the rest of the world at this point in time to build order of some sort in the absence of leadership from the great powers, which is not what we're used to. But you know, in a world today in which you know, the smaller countries are able to assert themselves in the game of economic globalization and in the game of international multilateral institutions to a far greater extent than they were in previous centuries, the great powers can cause disorder, but they can only impose themselves so much on those smaller states. So it's up to them to do something about this. The question is, can they and will they at this point in time? And going back to what some of the other panelists have said so far, the EU's record is not necessarily great on this front right now. You know, relations between the European Union and Russia have descended from mere sort of political alienation in the post-2014, post-Ukraine crisis situation to now what appears to be a full-blown adversarial relationship as well, on a par with the US-Russia relationship. You know, the fact is that the European Union and individual European countries have not taken the opportunity to buttress the foundations of the security architecture and strategic stability in Europe in the absence of American, and Russian leadership on that front. We've seen the US and Russia withdraw now, both from the Open Skies Treaty, from the INF Treaty. This architecture, you know, that was constructed in the Cold War and afterwards, appears to be, you know, on its way out, and Europe has not demonstrated leadership on that front. As it comes to, you know, in the Asian, you know, Sino-American context of that rivalry, you know, India and ASEAN possess the power to a certain extent to check China's, you know, ability to dominate Asia, as it were. Asia has been multipolar for almost all of its history, as Parag Khanna has noted, except for perhaps under the Mongols. And the presence of nuclear weapons there ensures that that multipolarity will remain in place. But nonetheless, you know, has India or has ASEAN risen economically at this point to the extent where they can fundamentally change the dynamic, at least for the next decade, of Sino-American confrontation? I'm not too sure on that front either. And in fact, you know, China's rise has been so meteoric that regardless of how quickly India is growing economically right now, it's hard to imagine India catching up in any appreciable fashion. And there are, of course, other geographic limitations that India faces in being able to contain sort of China's presence there as well. I'll conclude, you know, absolutely on this point. So basically, the conclusion is that because of this, the search for order in the 2020s is going to be minimalistic by definition. That is just unavoidable as far as my analysis leads me to conclude. And so the question that maybe, you know, I would pose to everyone else, or at least to our audience, to think about as a result of order being minimalistic in the 2020s is that will this minimalism actually open space for, you know, greater agreement on traditional global governance issues like climate change and others, you know, or actually will it make it harder, right? Will that dynamic of confrontation between the great powers basically suck all the oxygen out of the room and make it difficult for them to compromise on other issues because, you know, each needs to be tending to their own power base, including economic power base, military power base, et cetera, or rather will actually a more honest and minimalistic international order in which it's no longer expected that we share the same values eventually make it easier for some of these compromises to be reached over the coming decade. Thanks very much, Brendan.
Well, very, very thought-provoking and very, very stimulating. Thanks very much indeed. Just as one slight point that I didn't understand, you talked about the lack of leadership. It seems to me that possibly there is a de facto leadership being exercised by America and China in this clash of systems. Have I misunderstood or misrepresented your view there?
Well, I mean, there's certainly an attempt by the United States to rally its allies and partners into some sort of coalition vis-a-vis China. But the fact is that most of those partners don't 100% want to pick sides and don't want to join a rigid, monolithic coalition that resembles the Cold War. The whole point of the end of the Cold War is that we don't want the Cold War to be repeated. And then we believe in some sort of global international order. So, you know, is there a desire by many countries, for example, in the Asia-Pacific region to have a forward American military presence in the region and that is, you know, deeply engaged in the diplomatic architecture of the region? Absolutely. You know, Japan, for example, wants that from the United States. Does Japan want a rigid zero-sum confrontation between the United States and China? No, right? So can you find a middle ground between those two things? Is it actually possible? Or is simply the logic of rivalry and of contestation of norms between the United States and China at this point such that it's in fact impossible to find some sort of middle ground to share power between both sides? I think about this a lot, and I really don't know the answer to the question. But what it does imply fundamentally This goes back to what I was saying in my remarks, is simply that because third countries have enough weight right now to exert themselves more than ever before in global history, that's by definition going to limit the extent of A, American singular hegemonic leadership, and B, great power collective leadership among all the great powers. That doesn't mean that those aren't good things. I think the world would benefit from a more engaged America, from American leadership. I think the world would benefit if the great powers would get along and stop causing instability. But alone, a singular hegemonic leadership or collective great power leadership is not enough, right? The other states in the world also have a say in today's international order, and that's not a norm. That's not, something that we need to stand up to defend, which you hear in Europe all the time. We have to defend the right of small countries to choose, et cetera. No, this is just a reality. This is just the structure of the international order that we have today.
Good. Thank you very much. We've had a lot of very interesting presentations, obviously, and we had a lot of very interesting questions. I'd urge the panelists over the next few minutes to look at these questions and comments, some of which have been very, very profound and very, very telling. But there's one issue I'd like to begin, well, two issues I'd like to begin with, asking Velina and Olaf to comment on, coming back to you later, Zach. Is the whole phrase multilateral rules-based order a misnomer? Is it a dangerous description, a misdescription in which various assumptions are smuggled in, which because they're unexamined assumptions could potentially be dangerous? And secondly, can we say something more about climate change? If climate change is, as increasing numbers of countries and individuals take it to be, an increasingly imminent threat, not just to the world order, but to the world, is it going to be possible against the background of conflict and confrontation that Zach has described and others have described it implicitly, is it going to be possible to engage seriously with this question? Can I ask Olaf to respond to those two questions? And obviously, if there are other things which have been said by the other panelists, to comment on them as well.
Thank you. On the first one, that's a very, very tough one. I must admit. I would still say that I would rather agree overall with Zachary that you of course you don't have one order, but you can have a mix of orders, or let's say mix, let's say, of multilateral orders, or multilateral, let's say, even rule-based orders. And by the way, this is maybe to put it, because this is of course quite a metaphorical questions, but actually to put it a bit into practice, China does play by the rules in these organizations, in most of the organizations. I would argue that they don't do in the WTO, or they pretend to, but they don't. But in many organizations, actually, they use the possibilities they have. So actually, the multilateral rule-based order, you can have very different actors which claim to adhere to the same rules but do something completely different. So this is maybe on the first question. On the second question, climate change, I would have a tiny hope that this might be an issue where you could bring actors, let's say, from these opposing camps together to a certain extent. I think this is one thing which you saw also during the Biden Putin summit. However, if you look at concrete negotiations, and this is a bit sometimes my job in the let's say, when we talk about New York as a restaurant and Geneva as a kitchen. So I'm trying to look at the kitchen regularly. And if I look at very concrete deliverables, then I see that, for example, on fisheries negotiations, which is a key issue for, let's say, sustainability, because of the imminent danger of overfishing. The negotiations have been dragging along for years, even decades. And the ultimate deadline was 2020, and they're still negotiating. Probably they will reach something by the end of the year. But even on, let's say, issues which are about sustainability, climate change, it will be very, very, very difficult to get, let's say, on a common denominator. Now, maybe I would like to add one thing, because I would underline what Velina Tchakarova said in a presentation, meaning, yes, you do see the dragon bear in the Human Rights Council very clearly, because now in this year, you see both of them are actually members, and you see on actually so far, I think all the votes, they have been voting the same way, and sometimes it has been only them with their best pals, I think Venezuela, Cuba, and so on, voting in line, but they have been very close. And you saw it also last year when I think it was last year, beginning this year, it might have been beginning this year, when Mrs. Tsikhanovskaya was from Belarus was speaking at the UN Human Rights Council. You had a very good tandem by China and Russia trolling Mrs. Tsikhanovskaya for procedural things. We cannot have a virtual presentation and so on here. So this is actually, all this is unprocedural and so on and so on. And they were trolling the session from the beginning to the very end. And this was a perfect partnership. I also add here in the chat, just for interest, because we have actually been looking at that on the voting behavior in 2019, and we have done this also for 2020, which countries have been voting most of the times with China. And it's a very interesting map you get out of there. And there are a few surprises, but I'm sure that if we do the same map for 2021, then Russia will be deeply red, voting basically probably on every single issue together with China. That's just to add to what Velina Tchakarova said.
Thank you very much. Velina, would you like to answer my two questions and comment on anything else said by the panelists?
I very much hope that you will not expect from me to comment on climate, as you will make me suffer, because I'm a geopolitical analyst and climate is one of the issues that I definitely don't want to take a position on, or let me put it very cynically, I don't expect any of the current decision makers to be around by 2060 to take responsibility for a decision of decarbonization.
Right, but they may be responsible for the situation.
I'm trying to stick to my portfolio, which is geopolitics and geoeconomics. And I do understand the whole debate, and I can also actually extrapolate from this debate that there's definitely a lot of battles for power behind the curtains, because if you take the climate debate, for instance, as a possible new arena for creating narratives, once again, China and Russia are actually playing by the rules of engagement, international engagement. They show interest. They want to be part of the debate, but I don't think that this is a sincere intention, rather than, like I said, once again, more or less maximization of own interests, because of course it's easy to promise complete decarbonization by 2050 or 2060 when you know that a lot will happen in the meantime. So this is the first. Second, we have, I think, 1 billion of consumers in China that are still not in the possession of car. Let me just remind you that the middle class is going to grow where? Actually, in China. Unfortunately, we are facing a trend of shrinking middle class in the West, both United States and Europe. But if we take this 1 billion just as an example of people who might potentially want to buy a car, I don't think that all of them will buy an electric car in the next 30, 40 years. Once again, let's take the issues from both sides. Let's discuss the common ground and take into consideration the common value. But on the other side, what my task is to always look for the struggle for power and maximization of own interests. That's the way I actually analyze their behavior. And one final example on climate. Now, Russia, of course, and if you look what has been happening in the last 2-3 years, and I have been having these disputes with academics for the last 10 years, when academia was absolutely sure that the Arctic will never be used as a in terms of geopolitics, will never be actually instrumentalized. And in reality, what is happening now is a militarization of the Arctic. Why? Because at some point, the expectation is that it's going to be a new transport and trade route. With whom? Once again, with China, because China can then build an alternative maritime route to the one that is now actually passing the Indo-Pacific region and is very much in the control by the West, by the United States and allies. And given this reality, once again, its climate is packaged, but at the core, they are pretty much the same hardcore national interests. Should I go, because I saw a lot of questions also.
Well, can you comment on the phrase multilateral?
Multilateral, yes. Well, let me present you very shortly my idea, because to be honest with you, I very much follow a realpolitik approach in the way I assess state behavior and also institutional behavior, because states create institutions to serve their interests, to reflect their idea of rules, norms, standards, and so on and so forth. And I always tend to say that because I often hear that this argument that China should have the same opportunities to shape the global order the way the United States did. However, as seen from my realpolitik perspective, I still very much see quite of a unilateral global order, because United States is still the only global power that has global power projections that can actually control, securitize, intervene at every point on the map worldwide, and has also this network of allies and partners. However, this kind of competition between the United States and China is now made up not only by institutional decoupling, as I outlined, but also by technological, keyword fourth industrial revolution, and geo-economic and geopolitical one. And I see actually all these emerging alliances right now as being shaped by the fact that all middle powers, these are the regional actors, these are European powers, for instance, take also other Western partners, but take also countries such as Russia or Japan and so on. They're all oscillating right now between the two systems of power, the one that is existent and the one that is emerging. So they are oscillating, trying to maximize their gains, trying not to take sides. This is a major discussion, by the way, that the European Union is trying actually to oscillate between the United States and China, not taking sides, wanting to do business as usual with China while being a security partner of the United States. And I argue that my thesis is that at some point, every regional actor will have to take sides, whether we like it or not. And I think that this will very much depend on the way how China will manage to become a second pole of global power, whether it will succeed and how it will succeed. So once it starts challenging all these existing international structures and networks, would be definitely one of the signals for me that it has more serious intention. So I don't see really a global multilateral order, rather than regional multilateral orders being shaped by ad hoc actors constellations, long-term existing actors constellations, new ones, keyword Indo-Pacific. Just take the example with Quad, with the quadrilateral cooperation format. And we will witness even more from there. And they create this impression of multipolarity, while I see actually a kind of a trend towards system bipolarity. Once again, at the top, I see only one potential systemic rival to the United States. And beyond, at this meta level, we have various. There are many, many, many more than we have observed during the Cold War. And it is quite exciting time. to be aligned.
Oh, well, living in interesting times. Some people think that's a bad idea. Zach, can you respond to those two questions and anything else that you want to talk about? But also, I think the word liberalism figured more largely in your presentation than in others, I think. And I'd ask you something about that. What's the implication of what you were saying that there can be a separation between economic and political liberalism? And how does that interact, if that separation is possible, with the confrontation between the United States and China? Is it possible that the confrontation between the political aspect of liberalism will continue, but there may be some convergence on economic liberalism?
Right, precisely right, which is to say that, what I was referring there was basically to the global order rather than, the actual contestation between the two sides. So yes, well, that is to say that in the emerging global order, because political liberalism will be contested, it will not be, a fundamental pillar necessarily of the emerging international order, whereas economic liberalism, is contested in other ways. I mean, it's contested by populists, I assume. So, the extent to which globalization, or the fashion in which globalization on an economic, from an economic perspective, will remain, a pillar of the global order, is to a certain extent something that is in flux as well. But I think that the cat is largely out of the bag there, and even the pandemic, I think, is not arresting this. You might see some, reorientation of sort of critical supply chains, but by and large, globalization writ large is not over. Obviously, the big question, of course, is will these political and ideological forms of contestation eventually supersede the economic trends that we've seen towards greater globalization over recent decades? That's entirely possible, right? It could be that the economic integration, the economically integrated nature of the U.S.-China relationship could act as an inhibitor, as a coolant, on the descent of the U.S.-China relationship into rivalry. But that nonetheless, the ideological differences that are currently being framed, that are perhaps being framed too starkly and do not reflect the reality, that this is some sort of ideological conflict on a par with the Cold War. But nonetheless, the momentum behind each side's desire to frame this as an ideological conflict could in fact supersede that economic logic at some point. Where the breaking point actually lies is a very good question, and it fundamentally relates to the question I think that Velina was raising just now about third countries, being forced to choose or not between both sides. Right now, China's largest trading partner is ASEAN. Larger than the trading relationship that China has with the EU or with the United States is the relationship that it has with ASEAN. And Japan and ASEAN and South Korea, trade with, and Taiwan even, trade with China is their bread and butter. And I don't see that going away anytime soon. In fact, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership was just inked, in recent months, which shows that, any form of competition between these parties, will exist in the security sphere. It will also exist in the economic sphere. But if it exists in the economic sphere, that's one that requires not full-fledged decoupling, but rather interaction in terms of who will actually write the rules and the patterns of interaction going forward, right? So I find this always interesting, that the natural reflex of liberal analysts in the West is to assume that contestation will lead always to decoupling. It might lead to decoupling in the political sense, in the sense that both sides will not share the same values. But in the economic sense, maybe that breaking point is not reached, right? Maybe a more stable form of interaction between the sides, involves certain red lines being established, certain contestation over economic norms and standards being established as well. But that doesn't mean that the fundamental trend of globalization is going away, right? So economic liberalism on a global stage, political globalization of liberal norms and values, and multilateralism all operate in different ways, right? There are different phenomena to a certain extent, even though they are somewhat related. And they're not perfectly related because the relationship that political liberalism has on economic liberalism, that level of dependency is far greater than the reverse. Right? Everyone likes to think that liberal political values and economic values go fundamentally together because, capitalism is about economic freedom and human rights, and democracy are about individual political freedoms. And so since it's always about individual freedoms one way or another, they always necessarily go together. But the fact is, and we've seen this demonstrated not just in modern China, but also throughout modern history with mercantilist powers, is that capitalism and democracy don't always go together. Capitalism has predated modern liberal democracy. Capitalists and capital will go wherever it makes sense for that to go. And the relationship of dependency is much greater of liberal democracies on capitalism, precisely because liberalism, in order for liberalism to survive, it needs to enshrine property rights of some sort, right? This is fundamentally a liberal value for liberal societies, and therefore, liberalism is dependent upon capitalism in order to remain in place. The reverse is not true, right?
Thanks very much. Thank you. Olaf wanted to say something.
Yes, I would like to give a tiny bit of water into the wine of Zach. I'm not one of the prophets saying, "Oh, the economic liberalism is over with the pandemic," and some of the Building Back Better prophets have argued such. I don't agree. However, I think the image is mixed. And two remarks. First of all, we have seen actually in the WTO that tendencies of protectionism have risen quite strongly in the years ahead of the pandemic, actually. So even before the closure of borders and so on. So I'm curious how this trend will go on after the pandemic, because on the other side, we have seen that that supply chains have been quite resilient, actually. So it's a mixed message. And I would say, and this leads me to the second point, let's say continuous trade facilitation and the reduction of tariffs and so on is actually very strongly opposed by a certain group of countries which do not share this. So India and South Africa, and this is also a point we tend to see, of course, multilateralism primarily through the lens of U.S.-China rivalry. We should not forget that of course, I know you know that, of course, but it's much more complex in that sense that you have on certain issues, for example, WTO, the biggest rivals for, let's say, the Western camps are India and South Africa plus X, often the Africa group minus some states and others. For example, on the TRIPS waiver, you mentioned property rights. This is not China, Russia have not been that vocal on the issue. For example, you see that on the initiative of e-commerce, the EU, the US, China, and Russia are all on board. However, 80 countries are not, and most of them from the global south. So let's say this kind of this economic liberalism paradigm is actually challenged quite strongly by a group of states whose influence should not be completely underestimated. But just
thank you very much. Velina, have you anything more to say? I saw you nodding at one point and shaking your head at another.
I need to make one remark just to add something which I think is very significant, and that is that we are right now in this unique situation where the whole global system has turned into capitalist one. This is a unique situation. We have never had this before in the international relations. So we have capitalism. So we have, for instance, the situation of transnational capitalism versus national capitalism. We have the situation of market capitalism versus state capitalism, and so on and so forth. So we should keep in mind, while trying to make sense of all the trends and shifts and changes in the international relations, that right now this kind of system is there. With all its weaknesses, of course, we know that from the past. We know that the crises of capitalism, as being described not just by the Marxist authors, but also by significant economists in the West. Now, the question that emerges, of course, is if it is a global capitalist system, what kind of crisis this will produce for the West, and also for those that are in another state of development, in another state of probably some groups of countries will even skip certain circles of development and we jump, for instance, on the fourth industrial revolution track without even going through the third industrial revolution cycle. Even that would be possible if you, for instance, consider countries in Africa, that are now trying to digitalize. And we should also keep in mind, this is something that I found very fascinating, that the West, the West, had a package to offer, which was so appealing to many other states, but the package consisted of both the market capitalism coupled with the liberal order. So basically we had the political, economic, and human dimension. Now, for instance, I hear from my colleagues in India that they say, okay, we want to make products that are affordable for the 6 other billion people, because we as the West have been actually so far in our development that we have always looked only in front of us, right? So the question here is, how can we also make our model more affordable? Now, of course, it's also about economics. Once again, how to make our products affordable for the third, fourth, industrial revolution cycles participants, how to make our model more appealing. And here I would say something very controversial, very controversial. I would argue that we will run a risk if we try to project our values to third countries. We should actually strengthen our values community inwards. This is what we have built within the European Union and within the transatlantic community. Is something so valuable, we should cherish every day. The price that we've paid for it over decades is so high, but this should be a value community that is turned inwards. We should not run the risk of projecting values outwards, because then we run the risk that we will be missing from various equations where other countries, other actors will step in, will fill the vacuum, and we will not have a portfolio to offer to them, because we will conditionalize our portfolio. We will actually link it to values that are impossible for them to apply for various reasons.
Well, that's certainly controversial, and I saw both Olaf and Zach reacting. Olaf, would you like to comment?
Well, of course, this is a classic debate, but I would say that any value system which is not willing to be able, or to try at least to project certain of its values outside of its borders, will at some point fade. I mean, I agree with you that we should focus more, let's say, leading by example. That I agree, but if we do not have at least, and I'm not the discussion is with which instruments, of course, but if we do not have the ambition to project to a certain extent, then this will increasingly fade. And I would also argue that if we would not do the democracy promotion work which we do in the European neighborhood, with all its deficiencies, with all the lacking incentives sometimes, but I think then the situation would be worse. So, but this is, I think I'm on the other side of the spectrum on this very long debate. Thank you.
Can I ask you?
Clarification. Let the civil society do the job, because we have very strong civil societies. Let the civil society do the job, but do not expect from the political actors. This is my point. When they go outside, they need to protect our European interests. They have to deal with very volatile world, with highly nasty political actors. Let's not treat them gently. Let's actually act in the interest of our communities. Let the civil society do their job. They are best at it, but do not expect from the political actors and from the institutions to promote democracy, whereas actually the idea is to make the deals to protect our geopolitical interests. That was my point.
Do you think that China and Russia want to project their values? Do they seek to project their values, do you think? what is the end goal of the Chinese-Russian alliance that you discern?
The end goal of the Chinese, first and foremost, I don't call it an alliance. I call it a systemic coordination in key sectors and domains and areas of policy, economics, technology. And I don't want to experience a worst case situation, of course, of a dragon bear-led regional order, a kind of an alternative world. What I outlined in my scenario as a coexistence of two worlds, where you have one, we live in basically separate worlds. Starting from the technological spectrum, you have, we are completely separated in terms of internet, in space, in terms of social media, in terms of all these kind of networks that we have observed emerging and globalizing for the last 75 years, and specifically for the last 30 years, at some point being completely split into two worlds. This is a worst scenario for me. Of course, the worst of scenario will be a direct confrontation. Two fronts where you see both simultaneously engaging the West, creating problems. Let's take a potential scenario where China attacks Taiwan and Russia attacks a Baltic state, and this happens simultaneously. Well, this is definitely something we don't want to see.
Zach, do you want to make a comment on the original controversial claim from Velina?
Well, it's a very good question. I think that it actually, and I've seen a couple of these questions posed in the Q&A that are related to this, so maybe I'll bring this all together, which is that I think this demonstrates actually the difference between a materialist understanding of international affairs and a more idealist or normative understanding of international affairs, right? The big debate that's happening right now in the United States is a question concerning whether or not the United States needs to maintain its sort of position of leadership, or whether, you know, it's going to demonstrate more quote unquote restraint in its foreign policy. And proponents of restraint can make the argument that you can, you know, retreat, you know, for lack of a better term, and that this will actually strengthen the United States and strengthen the foundations of the international order, because that's a fundamentally realist understanding there. If you're not pushing other powers to, you know, ally with each other and balance against you, then you're able to have a more stable international order, right? So that's a materialist understanding based on material power. But if you look at the normative dimension, when you talk about stopping to promote our values on a global stage, and stopping perhaps even to promote certain norms at a global level in order to accommodate other powers, well, that leads fundamentally to order transition, right? If you simply believe in a materialist sense that an international order it depends on a balance of power, then the international order is either stable or it isn't, right? But if the international order is replete with normative content, if it's not just, you know, anarchy that's out there, then we're looking at a change fundamentally of that content, right? And so that's why I think that in the normative sense, it's much easier to see this sort of zero-sum rivalry come about, you know, regardless at this point, because as I was saying before, the cat's kind of out of the bag. Regardless of what, you know, the United States and the collective West choose to do, we're still in for sort of a very bumpy 2020s one way or another. And I'll sort of add on this to, Olaf was talking about this a little bit, about China playing to a certain extent by the rules, sometimes even agreeing more with you know, the United States than other, you know, third countries in the global South do, for sure. And the United States likes to point out that it only challenges sort of the unfair Chinese economic practices in which it engages. But the reality, of course, is that when China came out with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank during the Obama administration, which is a perfectly legitimate international institution, the United States still pressured its allies not to join unsuccessfully. And so basically it shows, you know, the extent to which, you know, American leadership of the international order is not the same thing as the rules-based order itself. But it shows something deeper as well, I think. It shows the confused nature of the order in which we inhabit right now, because those three major powers, the US, Russia, and China, it's possible to interpret them or to see them simultaneously as being status quo powers and revisionist powers at the same time, right? The United States is a status quo power because it's the hegemon, right? It wants to maintain its hegemonic position and of leadership. But it's also a revisionist power because it wants to spread liberal values across the world and basically to create a single international order of global scope centered on itself, or at least has wanted to do that, right? So both of those elements are there. In the case of China, it's revisionist because it's challenging the existing hegemon. It's a rising power, but it's also status quo because it's depended on the international order that's existed for the past 40 years. Those rules, that open economic order to rise economically and to become the power that it is today. Same goes for Russia. Again, sowing instability in many respects, challenging the West frontally, but at the same time wanting to preserve something, wanting not to lose something that it already has, which is great power status and sort of a de facto sphere of influence of sorts in its near abroad. So all of those elements are there, and it leads to a confused international order, I think, because as I was saying before, this really is the first truly global international order. And so by definition, all powers are going to be revisionist because the rules of that order, as of right now, the rules and norms and principles and even values of that order have not yet been determined.
Very good. Can I ask everyone to sum up their views? Perhaps they've modified their views as a result of the discussion, but also to answer another question which a number of people have put. Is there any chance that internal political instability, both in Russia and China, will change entirely the discussion we've been having over the past hour and a half? Let's go back to Olaf. Any final conclusions that you want to give us, and also speculate on how stable is the present position? I'm struck by what we're talking about, although Zach rightly says there are elements both of status quo and revisionism, but we assume that the situation will be more or less as it is now, only more so. We haven't factored in the idea that there might be some radical discontinuity. Would you like to comment on that possibility, Olaf?
Well, that's I'm not a prophet, so I think it would be difficult for me to do that. However, I would say that what we have seen with other states is that even if the regime changes, the behavior in international fora changes, but oddly, it does not change 180 degrees. So we have that. I mean, of course, Russia and China are so big actors that it's very difficult to say. But if I look at the behavior of smaller states in Geneva-based organizations, you see the effect of regime change. But again, it's not a 180-degree change. So that would be something which I would also speculate for Russia and China. And on the other note, but I think there are much better experts here on this panel than me on the Dragon Bear. But I must say that I've been remembering about for I think a decade now of people arguing how unstable the Russian system is and that Putin is, it's very soon, it's over, and I don't know, and overstretched and this and that. He's still there and very alive and kicking. So is his regime. So I'm a bit more cautious regarding massive changes. I would address maybe just one question which has been asked by Nicholas McLean here. Who are the major allies in many issues? I've posted a couple of maps in the chat, which I think give already a picture. But aside from Russia on many issues, I would say Pakistan, very strong ally of China. Why is this important? Because Pakistan is often a very important actor in the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and where it leverages basically the entire vote of the group. So this is a very important ally, and many people here in Geneva say, I'm not sure I agree 100% that Pakistan is more influential than India here in Geneva. And then I would say a group of states, let's say the worst of the worst. So you have, of course, always Venezuela, Cuba, Belarus, of course, which are very strong allies, but you have also a couple of countries which kind of, for economic or political reasons, owe a lot to China or Russia. So Philippines, for example, Cameroon, some of other African states, Egypt is another example. In some cases, but not in all, some of the Gulf monarchies. But this really depends a bit on the issue. This is a very quick overview just to answer at least one question of the chat, which was directed a bit more to me, I think. Good.
Do you want to say anything more in conclusion?
I would say that I would expect that the authoritarian actors, authoritarian states will not pull back. We will see them increasingly assertive. This is what I would expect. but I would still say that all is not lost, even though we should bear in mind that we will not win every battle as a global West, but the probability to win at least some battles if we act united, both on personnel, policy and others, and if we coordinate with other, let's say, groups which are beyond the like-minded, will increase a lot and can make actually a difference.
Good, thank you very much. Velina.
Yes. Well, I think that we're moving towards a systemic bipolarity, in a sense that China will try to become the first Asian global power by becoming both rimland and heartland country, building both maritime and terrestrial connectivities. Olaf has already outlined some of the potential allies, partners, and this is a project that might take 20 years, might take 50 years, and of course it will very much depend on the political, societal stability. So there's always this first issue, the most important issue for countries such as China and Russia, it goes for both, that the political stability is guaranteed. So all the foreign policy initiatives or measures or successes are actually a function of how to stabilize and survive. First and foremost, of course, survival. So I think that even if the Russian president is no longer in power, which he's now managed to secure, actually his position for further 2 mandates, there will be no major shift. Russia will remain Russia. It is this imperialistic view on the world, on international relations. It's just in its geopolitical DNA. It will stay there. And China, it goes the same way. I mean, the political stability, the survival of the communist regime around now Xi Jinping is goal number 1. And all these kind of military adventures and foreign policy and security policy goals are a derivative from it. So we are moving definitely towards a kind of a systemic bipolarity. We, the West, specifically here in Europe, should really think about our options. I called this decade the Indo-Pacific decade. I think that the main arena of the global affairs in this decade will be the Indo-Pacific, from the eastern coast of Africa through the Indian Ocean to reaching to, of course, Southeast Asia, and then, of course, United States and Canada. And we, I mean, if we take UK, this is, of course, already pretty clear from their strategic documents that they are planning to expand and move there. But the European powers such as France, Germany, Netherlands needs to do something about it as well. And finally, there will be another major rivalry we should consider, and that is the one between China and India. I saw there is also a question about it. We don't have time for it. And here I think that the Europeans took a very clear, very strong geopolitical position. Yes, of course, the European Union is not a geopolitical actor, but the European Union is a very successful institutional geo-economic actor. And the way they decided to approach, or let's say reapproach India by relaunching the negotiations on free trade agreement and launching a strategy on Indo-Pacific was a very clever move, of course, inspired by the Portuguese presidency. And I am expecting more to happen. So not all hope is lost when it comes to the old continent. On the opposite, but we should be more daring. We should be more. We should be doing more. And like I said, we need a clear military footprint.
Good, thank you very much. Zach, the last word with you. Very, very appropriate that it goes to somebody from the Global Policy Institute with whom we're associated in this conference. So what do you want to give us as the final words of wisdom?
Wonderful, thank you. And I just want to congratulate you, Brendan. I think this might be the first Federal Trust event I've attended in which the word Brexit has not come up, I think. So that's wonderful.
Wait.
We'll wait for your concluding remarks, I suppose.
Exactly.
Wonderful. Okay, and that's one of the things that I remember most fondly, of course, from my time in London is you're always very piercing and insightful concluding remarks at every one of these events. I guess I agree very much with my co-panelists here. When it comes to the forthcoming decade, as Velina has pointed out, it might be an Indo-Pacific decade, but we may be in a Eurasian century. And I think that raises interesting questions about what the shape of order, including the normative content of that order, is going to be over the short, medium, and long terms. When it comes to potential changes within Russia, within China, or in the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership, I agree very much with Olaf. I don't think that you're going to see a 180 anytime soon. Even if you take in recent history the most obvious case of a 180 in a country's foreign policy. Let's take the Islamic Revolution in Iran, where the country went from being a solid important regional ally of the United States to challenging the United States frontally and completely. Even there, despite that brief shift, you did not see the fundamental geostrategic, geography-driven imperatives of Iranian foreign policy change overnight. Right, it remains defensive. It's rooted in the save for a few revolutionary aspects, of course, and is rooted fundamentally in the geography of the country. It just expresses itself differently right now because the regional hegemon, the United States, does not choose to engage in a strategy of twin pillars, with Saudi Arabia and Iran being both of its allies, but rather, leads a coalition of states versus Iran, and that leads to that country's foreign policy expressing itself in different ways. But the fundamentals don't change, right? And so the fundamentals won't change in Russia and China either. And when it comes to the regimes there, look, anything can happen, right? It's entirely possible that in a number of years, all of a sudden, everyone will be fed up with the Kremlin in Russia, and then we'll see a sea change in the regime. Will that lead to a sea change in the country's foreign policy? No, I don't think so. But, again, do I see Vladimir Putin going anywhere anytime soon? No, I don't. I think that, to a certain extent, despite the challenges, socioeconomic and political, socioeconomic challenges that Russia faces and the political challenges that his regime faces, I think we make a big mistake whenever there are protesters going out in the streets to sort of immediately jump to the conclusion that, oh, this is the end of Putin this time. This is the end of Putin this time. Well, no, I mean, there are protests, and in countries people protest, and they protest for all sorts of reasons. As long as the memory of the disorder of the 1990s in Russia is stronger, than the desire for change, and that remains the case right now, and people don't want to return to an era where the country was weak and literally falling apart, and people's life expectancies were plummeting, and there was not enough food to go around. I fully expect the current regime to remain resilient despite all of its challenges. And the logic of the Russo-Chinese partnership as well. Right now, it has its own logic. It has its own momentum, even absent, the regime type of both countries, which is helping, them to come closer together. Geography dictates that each has an imperative, in maintaining good relations with the other. Geopolitics, dictates that both sides has an interest in maintaining good ties with the other. And the United States might be a catalyst in that equation. It might help to push them even closer together. But each country is a great power in its own right. It has its own strategic doctrines and cultures, and they want to maintain their own maneuverability. And so they're going to continue that. They're going to maintain that sort of flexible partnership that they have right now, which I think is better for the two of them. It allows both of them to sort of desecuritize their strategic rears so that they can pursue their own core interests in Eastern Europe and in East Asia, respectively. But it also allows them to cooperate, on other levels, as well, including, in the realm of military cooperation in the Central Eurasian theater. And so whenever we point out, that these countries have, this is Michael Kaufman who says this, from Washington, D.C., whenever we point out that the two countries, have not achieved the level of, for example, military interoperability that exists, for example, in the Transatlantic Alliance, and that this is a knock against how close a relationship they can have. No, they're perfectly able to have a close, relationship in the absence of that as independent powers. And I think that that's probably good, not just for the two of them, but it's probably good for the world too, because, the eras of recent history that have been the most unstable, if you will, on a global level have been those in which Russia and China have not been getting along. So no, we don't want a Russo-Chinese rigid alliance, against the West. That would not be good. We don't want a zero-sum binary world order. But a good relations between the two, that helps to stabilize, as Velina was saying, the heartland of Eurasia is not necessarily a negative thing. I don't think anyone wants to go back to the late 1960s, during the Sino-Soviet split, or to the 19th century, when great powers were at each other's throats either. So just because they're non-liberal countries doesn't mean that we shouldn't be encouraging them to get along and to develop stable relations.
Good, thank you very much. I think it's been an absolutely fascinating and an enormously successful conference, because it's shown that we were asking the wrong question at the beginning, that the vocabulary we were employing was questionable and needed some scrutiny. One point I would make about multilateralism is that it does seem to me that when people use the word multilateralism, in fact, they are sometimes reflecting the pre-1990 history. And what people meant when they talked about multilateralism was referring to the way in which the Western alliance was structured. That there was an analysis, which I think had a lot of objective truth in it, that the United States, while being a hegemon, was a benevolent and consultative hegemon, and a hegemon that was particularly concerned to take into account the interests of its closest allies in NATO and Western Europe. And this related to an analysis, which absolutely was historically correct, of a more politically and economically liberal Europe and the United States that was a bulwark of stability against the Soviet Union. And the hope was that in 1990, that multilateralism within the Western camp, as it were, could extend itself indefinitely to the rest of the world. And it hasn't worked out that way. And whether it ever will or not is an unresolved issue. But certainly, if we're talking about the world as it is at the moment, the conclusion I draw from the conference we've had today is that the phrase "the rules-based multilateral world order" is something that is a phrase that needs to be treated with a great deal of suspicion, not because normatively it's a bad idea, but because it doesn't really capture a lot of the realities of our world and the likely development of our world over the foreseeable future. So thank you very much indeed. There's a definition of an expert as somebody who's confused as everybody else, but just knows about the subjects, more about the subjects on which he's confused. Well, we've certainly all become more expert this evening, being exposed to your expertise. Thank you very much. I'm going to applaud. I hope everyone else will. You'll be able to hear me, probably everyone else will. Thank you
didn't mention Brexit. What happened to Brexit?
Brexit is an attempt to undermine the multilateral world order, whatever definition you give to that. And I certainly don't think that Brexit is going to be able to reconstitute anything for the United Kingdom in the place of its participation in the multilateralism of the Western order. The European Union was a major element of the multilateralism of the Western alliance. And the attempt of the United Kingdom to opt out of that is ill thought out, is going to be very, very damaging and may well be disastrous. So that's my view on Brexit. Olaf, Velina, Zachary, thank you very much indeed. Thank you to everyone who's joined us, and we hope that you'll be able to join us for our next Konrad-Adenauer Foundation meeting, which will be later in the year. Thank you very much indeed. Good night. Good night. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Good night.
Goodbye. Goodbye.